Moses, the greatest prophet in human history. The account of the life of Moses, one of the greatest prophets in human history, is indeed filled with amazing events that have left a deep mark on the culture of many nations. The story of Moses begins with a dramatic twist of fate involving a cruel decree of the Egyptian Pharaoh. The Pharaoh of Egypt, who ruled the country during that era, felt increasingly threatened by the large Jewish population. As the number of Jews increased, Pharaoh feared a possible revolt that could shake his power. To prevent such a development, he made a radical decision: destroy all newborn Jewish boys. This was a cruel order aimed at suppressing a potential threat from the younger generation of Jews. There is a legend that there was a conspiracy of priests in Egypt to destroy Moses. They knew of his purpose and feared that he could free the nation of Israel. So they decided to get rid of him while he was still a child. Jochebed, Moses' mother, was well aware of the fate that awaited her newborn son. In spite of her fear and despair, she could not bear the thought of her child being taken from her life. So Jochebed decided to take a desperate step. She made a basket of reeds, carefully coating it with tar to make it waterproof. Then she put little Moses in it and let the basket float down the Nile River. It was a risky decision, for the river could take the baby anywhere, and no one could guarantee his safety. But Jochebed believed that her son's fate was in the hands of a higher power and hoped that someone would find him and save him. The basket with little Moses floated slowly down the river until it reached the place where Pharaoh's daughter was bathing. This girl, noticing the basket floating among the reeds, came closer and opened it. Inside she found a crying baby. Pharaoh's daughter's heart softened and she decided to take the child under her protection. So little Moses found himself in Pharaoh's house, though neither Pharaoh's daughter nor her father knew that the boy was the child Pharaoh wanted to destroy. Pharaoh's daughter gave the baby the name Moses, which means taken from the water or saved from the water. Moses, raised in luxury and privilege, lived a life of comfort and opportunity. He was raised in Pharaoh's court, surrounded by care and attention. His education was the best he could receive at the time. He studied the art of government, military strategy, and diplomacy. Because of this, Moses had the in-depth knowledge and skills necessary for successful leadership. However, despite all these advantages, Moses never forgot his true origins. He knew that his roots were in the nation of Israel, which had been in bondage to the Egyptians. This thought constantly dwelt in his soul, causing him to feel a sense of responsibility and compassion for his people. One day, when Moses was already an adult, an event occurred that changed his life forever. He accidentally witnessed a scene that shook him to the core. One of the Egyptians was brutally beating a Jew. Seeing a man being brutalized for no reason was unbearable for Moses. He couldn't just stand by and watch it. His inner voice told him that he needed to intervene and stop the injustice. Without thinking of the consequences, Moses rushed to the Jew's aid. In a fit of rage, he took the Egyptian's life. This act of aggression was well-meaning, but the consequences were unpredictable. Moses now realized that his life was in jeopardy. If the Egyptians learned of his act, he would surely be punished severely. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, Moses decided to flee Egypt. He realized that it was too dangerous to stay in a country where his life hung in the balance. He had to leave behind everything he knew and loved, including his privileged position and comfortable life. But Moses felt it was necessary to do so to save his own life and perhaps to fulfill some higher purpose. Upon leaving Pharaoh's palace, Moses came face to face with harsh reality. He had left behind the luxury and security previously available to him, and now he was to begin a new life in unfamiliar surroundings. Going into the wilderness, Moses had hoped to find shelter and tranquility, but instead he was faced with many hardships and privations. The days and nights dragged on endlessly, and each new day brought new trials. The desert was an inhospitable place, full of danger and hardship. Moses struggled with the heat of the day and the cold of the night, and suffered from thirst and hunger. He went through many trials that hardened his spirit and taught him how to survive in the most difficult conditions. Finally, after many days of wandering, Moses reached the land of Midian, a place where the local people lived, farming and herding livestock. Here Moses found shelter and protection. The local people welcomed him with kindness and hospitality, providing him with shelter and food. Among those who helped Moses was a local priest named Jethro. He offered Moses a job as a shepherd, which allowed him to settle in this new place. The work of a shepherd was simple, but it required a lot of patience and attention. Moses spent his days watching the flocks of sheep and goats, walking around the neighborhood, and reflecting on his life and purpose. In this humble occupation, Moses found peace and tranquility. The time spent alone gave him the opportunity to reflect on his past and future, to rethink his values and goals. He began to realize that his life had more meaning than simply existing in Pharaoh's court. Soon Moses met Jethro's daughter, Zipporah. She was a beautiful and kind girl who caught Moses' attention. A relationship developed between them, and soon they decided to get married. Marriage to Zipporah brought Moses the stability and joy he had long sought. Together they began to build a new life away from palace intrigue and conflict. Their sons Gershom and Eleazar were born to them. One day, on an ordinary day when Moses was tending the flock on the slopes of Mount Horeb, he noticed something quite unusual. In the distance, among the dry bushes and rocks, he saw a bush that burned with a bright flame, but, contrary to all the laws of nature, it did not burn. This phenomenon at once attracted his attention, and Moses, driven by curiosity and inner feeling, decided to come closer. As he approached the bush, the flame did not die down, but on the contrary, it seemed even brighter and more intense. Suddenly Moses heard a voice coming directly from the fire. The voice was powerful and all-pervasive, and he sensed that something supernatural was standing before him. It was the voice of God speaking to Moses with an important commission. A voice told Moses that he had been chosen for the great mission of freeing his people from Egyptian slavery. Moses was amazed and excited at this news. He could not believe that he would be the one to fulfill such an important task. Doubts began to creep into his mind. How would he, a simple shepherd, be able to handle such a difficult task? What if he failed? But God did not leave his doubts unanswered. He gave Moses several signs to confirm his divine origin and strengthen his faith. One of these signs was the staff that Moses held in his hand. God told him to throw the staff to the ground, and when Moses did so, the staff instantly turned into a living snake. God then commanded him to grab the serpent by the tail, and it turned back into a staff. This miracle amazed Moses and strengthened his confidence that he had indeed been chosen for an important mission. He realized that God would give him the strength and wisdom he needed to accomplish this task. Henceforth Moses knew that his life would never be the same again. Convinced of his mission and strengthened by the signs God had given him, Moses packed his belongings and set out on his journey back to Egypt. Along with him went his brother Aaron, who had also been called to help with this important task. The journey was long and tiring, but both brothers remained determined to do God's will. When they arrived in Egypt, the first thing Moses and Aaron did was to appeal to Pharaoh to let the Jews go free. They explained that God demanded the release of his people and warned of serious consequences if Pharaoh refused to comply. Pharaoh, however, was adamant. He felt that the loss of so many laborers would cause great damage to the country's economy. Moreover, he saw the Jews as potential enemies who could revolt, so he refused to let them go. So, God sent a series of plagues upon Egypt, each one becoming more and more devastating and terrible. The first execution was turning the water of the Nile into blood. All the water in the river turned red like blood and became undrinkable. Fish sank and the river began to emit a stench. This was a warning to Pharaoh, but he remained deaf to Moses' pleas. The second execution brought an invasion of toads. Toads infested all of Egypt, entering homes, kitchens, bedrooms, and even food. They jumped everywhere, creating unbearable living conditions. But even this did not break Pharaoh. The third execution was the gnat infestation. The little insects covered everything around, biting people and animals, causing excruciating suffering. The fourth execution was an invasion of flies. Huge swarms of flies swooped over the country, spreading disease and poisoning the air. The fifth plague was the pestilence of livestock. All the domestic animals of the Egyptians began to fall sick and die, leaving the people destitute. The sixth punishment was boils. The Egyptians began to suffer from painful sores and boils that covered their bodies. The seventh execution was hail. The sky opened up and huge hailstones rained down on the fields and homes of the Egyptians, destroying crops and buildings. The eighth plague was locusts. Hordes of locusts swarmed over the country, eating what was left of the crops. The ninth execution was darkness. For 3 days Egypt was in total darkness, as if night had fallen on the earth. The people could not see each other or move around in total darkness. Finally, the last one, the 10th execution, was the worst of all. At midnight God sent a fallen angel who went through the whole country destroying all the firstborn children in the Egyptian families, including Pharaoh's firstborn son. This was the last straw of patience for Pharaoh. The loss of his own son made him realize that resistance to God's will was pointless. He finally agreed to let the Jews go, but he did so with great reluctance and anger. In letting the Jews go, Pharaoh hoped they would return soon, but God had other plans. The Jewish people began their long journey to the Promised Land, leaving behind years of slavery and suffering. When the Jews left Egypt, they took with them everything they could carry. They left without looking back, leaving behind years of slavery and suffering. They traveled through the vast desert, where they would spend many years before reaching the Promised Land. Moses led this great exodus, guided by God's instructions, which he received through visions and revelations. However, the journey was not an easy one. The harsh nature of the desert tested the endurance and resilience of the people. Every day was a struggle for survival. Sandstorms, scorching sun, and lack of water made the journey extremely difficult. But the most difficult test was not physical, but spiritual. The people often began to murmur, complaining about the lack of food and water, and expressing doubts about the rightness of their chosen path. At such times Moses became a mediator between God and his people. He turned to the Lord with prayers and requests for help, and God always responded to his calls. In answer to Moses' prayers, God sent the manna of heaven to feed the people. The manna fell from heaven every morning, and the people gathered it to make a meal. It was a miracle that kept them strong and kept their faith in God. Also, when the people were thirsty, Moses would turn to God and he would give instructions on how to get water. One day, when there was no water left, Moses struck a rock with his staff and pure water flowed out, quenching the thirst of thousands of people. This miracle reminded the people that God was always near and ready to help them in their time of need. Nevertheless, in spite of all the miracles and support from above, the people continued to have doubts and fears. They remembered the comfort they had in Egypt and wondered whether it was worth leaving their familiar life for an uncertain future. But Moses remained steadfast in his faith and continued to lead the people forward, assuring them that God was leading them to a better life. The crossing of the Red Sea was one of the most significant and symbolic events in the history of Moses and the Jewish people. As the Jews advanced through the desert after leaving Egypt, they already thought they were beyond the reach of Pharaoh and his army. However, they soon discovered that Pharaoh had changed his mind and sent his powerful army in pursuit of the fugitives. Pharaoh's army quickly overtook the Jews and the situation became critical. The Red Sea stretched before them, blocking the way to freedom, and the formidable force of Egyptian warriors approached from behind. There seemed to be no way out, and the fate of the people hung in the balance. But Moses, faithful to his calling and God's support, did not panic. He turned to the Lord in prayer, asking for a miracle that would enable his people to avoid extinction. And the miracle happened. Moses raised his staff, and at his word the sea began to part, creating a wide dry passage. According to one of the mystical traditions, when Moses received revelations on Mount Sinai, he received a special sword from God. This sword was called the Sword of Angels, and it had incredible power. It is said that it was with this sword that Moses parted the Red Sea, allowing his people to cross safely. It is said that the sword was made of pure light and fire, and no one but Moses could hold it. After Moses' death, the sword disappeared and its whereabouts remain a mystery. The Jews, seized with awe, hastened to walk across this unexpected bridge leading to freedom. The water stood on either side of the passage like walls held up by an invisible force. Pharaoh's army, seeing the Jews crossing the sea, also rushed after them, trying to catch up with the fugitives. But as soon as the last Jew set foot on the land of the opposite shore, Moses raised his staff again, and the waters of the Red Sea returned to their place, slamming with great force. Disaster struck Pharaoh's army, the waves swallowed the soldiers, and none of them survived. After the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, the Jews continued their journey to the Promised Land. However, their journey was much more difficult and longer than they had expected. They spent 40 years in the desert, facing countless hardships and trials. There is a legend that Moses not only led his people through the wilderness, but also guarded them from their enemies with a cloud of fire. This cloud followed Israel day and night, illuminating the way and protecting them from attacks. When enemies tried to approach the Israelite camp, the cloud turned into a wall of flame, repelling attacks and scattering the enemy. It is believed that this cloud was a manifestation of the divine protection given to Moses by God. Life in the wilderness was harsh and unfriendly. Hunger and thirst became the constant companions of the people. Lack of sufficient food and water forced them to find ways to survive under extreme conditions. At times it seemed as if God had forgotten about his people, and many began to doubt the rightness of their chosen path. The monotony of the desert was especially hard to bear. Each day was similar to the previous one: endless sands, scorching sun, and rare oases. Some of the Jews openly expressed their discontent and demanded a return to Egypt. They argued that it was better to live in slavery but have a roof over their heads and regular meals than to wander in the desert, not knowing when their journey would end. These sentiments caused unrest and rebellion within the people. Moses, as leader and prophet, tried to calm the people and remind them of the purpose of their journey. He repeated tirelessly that God was leading them to the Promised Land, where abundance and freedom awaited them. But even his authority and God's support did not always succeed in convincing everyone. Throughout the 40 years, Moses was repeatedly confronted with various difficulties caused by the discontent and distrust of the people. There were times when the people tried to appoint new leaders or even return to Egypt. But Moses remained faithful to his calling and continued to lead the people forward in spite of all the difficulties. There were conflicts, disputes, and disagreements within the people. Moses had to act as a judge and conciliator, settling disputes and restoring order. According to some sources, Moses also received from God a special book containing the secrets of the universe. This book was called the Book of Secrets, and it contained the knowledge of all things from the creation of the world to the end of time. It is said that this book was written on golden tablets, and Moses kept it in a special ark. The book was to remain hidden from the eyes of mere mortals until the time came for its contents to be revealed. Some apocryphal texts say that Moses encountered the Tree of Life, which was located in the center of paradise. According to this myth, the Tree of Life represented the source of eternal youth and immortality. Moses, being near the tree, could have lived forever, but chose instead to fulfill his mission on earth. There is also a version that Moses planted the seed of the Tree of Life in the Promised Land, and it became the source of vitality for all the people of Israel. After a long journey through the desert, Moses was instructed by God to climb to the top of Mount Sinai. This ascent was not easy. The mountain was considered sacred, and Moses had to perform ritual purifications in order to be worthy to meet God. At the top of the mountain, Moses spent many days waiting, preparing for the big event. Finally, God appeared to Moses and handed him the stone tablets on which the 10 Commandments were inscribed. These commandments represented the fundamental moral and ethical principles that were to guide the people of Israel for centuries to come. The commandments cover various aspects of human life and relationships. It is forbidden to worship other gods or make idols for oneself. God's name is to be used with respect and reverence. The Sabbath day is to be devoted to resting and worshiping God. Children are to respect and honor their parents. Each person's life is sacred and must not be taken away. Marital fidelity and purity of relationships are important to maintain harmony in society. The property of others must be protected and respected. Truth is important in relationships between people, and lying is unacceptable. The desire to possess what belongs to another is contrary to the principles of justice. Another man's wife is the sacrament of another marriage, and coveting her violates the sanctity of the family bond. One day, when the people began to murmur again because of the lack of water, Moses, as usual, turned to God for help. This time God told him to speak to the rock so that water would flow out of it. However, Moses, perhaps under the influence of fatigue or irritation, decided to do something different. He struck the rock with his staff, and the water did flow. This act provoked God's anger. Perhaps because Moses showed a lack of faith that God's word was powerful enough in itself to cause a miracle. Or perhaps because he failed to follow the exact instruction God had given him. Whatever the case, God considered this act a breach of trust and deserving of punishment. As a result, God announced to Moses that he would not enter the promised land. This decision was a great blow to Moses, who had devoted his life to freeing his people and leading them to the promised land. Nevertheless, God allowed Moses to climb to the top of Mount Nebo, from where he could see the promised land with his own eyes. After climbing the mountain, Moses was able to see all the territory that God had promised to his people. He saw the fertile land, the green hills, and the rivers running through it. Despite this, he was not destined to set foot on the land. Moses died on the summit of Mount Nebo before entering the promised land. He was buried in a valley near Beth-Fegar, but the exact place of his burial is unknown. Some sources claim that his grave is guarded by angels and no one knows where it is. The story of Moses ends on this note. His life is full of great achievements and sacrifices, but the finale of his journey is tinged with a touch of tragedy. Nevertheless, his legacy lives on in the hearts of generations to come, and his role in the liberation of the people of Israel will remain an enduring symbol of faith, courage, and devotion to God.